The blood hit the floor before anyone moved. Not a drip, a pour. Thick and fast, spreading under the gurney wheels while 3 nurses stood frozen in the doorway of trauma bay. 2 and a senior physician barked the wrong order into the wrong ear. And in the middle of all that noise, all that panic, all that expensive medical training seizing up at once, one person didn't flinch. She bent down, pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, and her eyes went somewhere else entirely. Somewhere cold and practiced and very, very far from Harlo Creek, Wyoming. Nobody in that emergency room knew what she'd seen before this. Nobody knew what she'd survived, what she'd carried out of places that didn't appear on deployment maps. They just knew her as the quiet one, the rookie. The nurse Dr. Marcus Hale liked to make an example of. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they'd been. If this story hits you somewhere deep, follow along until the very end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift started like every other Tuesday at Harlo Creek General, a waiting room full of people who'd rather be anywhere else, a vending machine stuck on B4, and the specific kind of institutional fluorescent lighting that made everyone look 3 days past their expiration date. Nora Vasquez clocked in at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her shift technically began. She did this every day, not because the hospital required it, not because anyone noticed, but because 13 minutes was enough time to check the board, read the overnight notes, and understand what she was walking into before she walked into it. She was 28 years old, medium height, dark hair pulled back without ceremony, the kind of face that people looked at and immediately stopped thinking about, unremarkable by design almost, the way some people learn to take up less visual space. She had calluses on both hands that she'd stopped explaining. She drank her coffee black and cold because she'd grown out of caring whether it was warm. She wore the same style of navy blue scrubs every day and kept an extra pair in her locker because she'd learned that lesson the hard way, in a different context, in a different life. Her badge said N. Vasquez, RN, Emergency Department. It didn't say anything else. She preferred it that way. The ER at Harlo Creek General was a mid-size facility serving a town of about 60,000 people tucked into the western edge of Wyoming, far enough from anywhere that serious trauma cases sometimes arrived in questionable condition just from the transport time. The staff was lean, the resources were adequate if you didn't look too carefully. The hierarchy was rigid in the way hierarchies get rigid when a few people have been there long enough to start treating the building like personal property. Dr. Marcus Hale had been there 11 years. He was 46, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the unshakable confidence of a man who had never once been genuinely wrong in his own mental ledger. He was a good surgeon, technically competent, fast, occasionally brilliant under pressure. He was also the kind of doctor who treated every mistake by someone below him as a referendum on that person's fundamental worth, and treated his own mistakes as anomalies caused by external factors. He had, in the 4 months since Norah joined the ER staff, called her the liability in front of the team on 2 separate occasions. He'd questioned her triage decisions loudly and publicly, always in the hallway, always when the shift was at its busiest and the most people were watching. Once he'd made her repeat a patient handoff 3 times in a row, not because her report was wrong, she'd checked it, but because he didn't like the way she delivered it. Too flat, he'd said. Too mechanical. You sound like you're reading off a wall, he'd told her, in front of 2 other nurses and an orderly. Patients need to feel like a human being is talking to them. You understand that? Human being. Norah had said, "Understood, doctor," and moved on. This was what she always said. "Understood, doctor." It drove him crazy, she suspected, because it gave him nothing to push against. But she'd had instructors whose idea of teaching was shouting until something cracked, and she'd learned a long time ago that the only leverage they had was a reaction. Remove the reaction. Remove the leverage. She'd learned that in a context considerably more high stakes than an emergency department in Wyoming. The morning was manageable. An overnight chest pain who turned out to be anxiety and acid reflux. A 16-year-old with a fractured wrist from a skateboarding incident whose mother was more upset about the skateboard than the wrist. A 73-year-old woman named Dolores who came in every 3 weeks with vague shortness of breath that was really loneliness dressed up in medical vocabulary. and who Norah always spent a few extra minutes with because the extra minutes were free and the woman's eyes changed when somebody actually listened. Around 9 a.m., Doctor. Hale arrived with his resident, a nervous third-year named Prakash, who moved through the department like he was trying not to disturb the air. Hale reviewed the board, made 2 changes to existing orders without explanation, and then found Norah at the medication station. Vasquez, the patient in Bay 6, what did you chart for his pain response? 7 out of 10 at intake, dropped to 4 after the first ibuprofen dose. I noted some guarding in the lower left quadrant and flagged it for possible. I read the chart. Then you have the information. He looked at her for a moment. I'm asking you because I want to hear whether your verbal account matches what you wrote, or whether you're filling in gaps retroactively. This was a new one. She met his eyes. They match. You're certain? I'm certain. He held the look for another second, then turned away. The guarding could be nothing. Could also be early peritoneal signs. I'll take a look. He walked off. Prakash gave Norah a brief apologetic glance she wasn't supposed to notice, then followed. She turned back to the medications. Her jaw was tight, which she allowed for approximately 4 seconds. And then it wasn't. Sandra Okafor, the charge nurse, and the closest thing Norah had to an ally in the department, appeared at her elbow holding a coffee that had been sitting too long. You know, Sandra said quietly, most people would have at least blinked. Blinking doesn't help. Neither does being a human statue, but at least it's entertaining. Sandra leaned against the counter. She was 51, Nigerian-American, with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd worked emergency nursing for 22 years and had decided that the only way to survive it was to maintain a consistent gallows humor. He's been like this since Dr. Farouk left. Before that, he had someone to argue with at his own level. Now, he just goes down the ladder. I've noticed. He put something in your file last week. I'm not supposed to know that, and you're not supposed to know that I told you. Norah looked at her. What kind of something? Concerns about clinical judgment and communication under pressure, which translates to doesn't react the way I want her to react. I've seen him do this before. Sandra's voice dropped another register. 3 nurses, all good, all gone within a year. Norah absorbed this. Thanks for telling me. I'm not telling you to scare you. I'm telling you because you should know what's coming so you can decide what to do about it. What Norah didn't say, what she filed away in the same internal drawer where she kept everything that didn't serve her in the immediate moment, was that she'd survived things that made Marcus Hale's personnel file notation look like a parking ticket. What she said instead was, understood. Sandra looked at her for a moment. You know, that word is either very zen or very unsettling. I genuinely cannot tell which. The morning became afternoon. The afternoon was busier. A fender bender that produced 4 patients with varying injury levels. A diabetic crisis in a 60-year-old man who'd run out of insulin 2 days earlier and hadn't told anyone. A toddler who'd swallowed a small magnet and whose parents were oscillating between terror and guilt in a way that required as much management as the medical situation. Norah worked steadily. She was good at this. Not in the way people describe nurses in inspirational social media posts, with soft adjectives about compassion and heart, but in the technical, practical, load-bearing way. She could read a patient's color change from across a room. She knew when a vital sign trend meant something before the machine alarmed. She had learned years ago, under circumstances that would have disqualified most people from nursing school by sheer trauma alone, that the difference between a person living and dying was sometimes 30 seconds, and the right decision made without hesitation. She did not talk about where she had learned this. At 2:15 p.m., the call came in. It came first to the charge desk as a radio transmission from county dispatch, and the words moved through the department like a current, quiet, then not quiet, then loud. Mass casualty event, Highway 34 westbound, mile marker 77. Estimated 12 to 20 victims, multiple GSWs, blast injuries. First wave, ETA 11 minutes. The emergency department had a mass casualty protocol. Most hospitals do. It existed on laminated cards in 3 locations and in the memory of every charge nurse who'd ever run a drill. It had not been activated at Harlo Creek General in 6 years. Sandra was already on the phone. Norah was already moving. The next 8 minutes were controlled chaos, the beds reconfigured, the overflow areas prepped, The off-duty staff called in, the surgeons paged, the blood bank notified. Norah moved through all of it without wasted motion, checking supplies, positioning equipment, mentally categorizing the trauma bays by acuity capacity. Doctor. Hale appeared in the department at the 6-minute mark, buttoning his coat, and immediately began restructuring the setup she and Sandra had built. Move Bay 3 back to standard trauma config. I don't want the airway cart there. I want it at the head of Bay 2. The current position? Sandra started. I know where I want it. Norah didn't argue. She moved the cart. But she noted, with the part of her brain that cataloged things without broadcasting them, that the current position was better. The airway cart at Bay 3 meant a single provider could service both Bays 2 and 3 without crossing the main traffic corridor. What Hale wanted put it in a location that would create a bottleneck the moment 2 critical patients arrived simultaneously. She said nothing. The first ambulance arrived at 2:27 p.m. The patient was a man in his late 40s, already intubated in the field, with a GSW to the right chest and secondary fragmentation injuries across the left arm and shoulder. The paramedics' report was fast and clipped. They'd had a rough transport, lost 1 patient en route, had 2 more right behind them. Hale took the first patient. Norah positioned herself at Bay 2. The second ambulance was 90 seconds behind the first. This patient was younger. She read male, early 30s, dark clothing, injuries that didn't match the narrative she'd been given. GSW to the abdomen, but the entry wound was too clean, too deliberate. The field medics said the patients had been in vehicles caught in what they were calling a highway accident. The wound pattern said otherwise, but that wasn't Norah's current problem. Her current problem was the blood pressure reading Prakash just called out. 70/40. He's dropping. She was already at the patient's side, already running her hands over his abdomen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had assessed casualties in conditions where guessing wrong meant a body bag. 2 large-bore IVs right now. Hang 2 units of O negative, run them wide open, get me an ultrasound. Prakash hesitated. Dr. Hale has his own patient. This one is 60 seconds from losing his pressure entirely. 2 IVs, now. Something in her voice apparently settled the question, because Prakash moved. Norah did the ultrasound herself. 30 seconds of focused pressure over the abdomen, and the picture was clear, free fluid in the peritoneum, significant. He was bleeding internally, probably from a mesenteric vessel, and the rate at which his pressure was dropping told her the bleeding was not slowing down on its own. He needs the OR, now, not in 10 minutes, right now. His pressure, another nurse started. I know what his pressure is. That's why he needs the OR and not another liter of saline. Where is the surgical team? OR1 is occupied. OR2 should be available. Then call it. Move him. From behind her, across the controlled chaos of the department, she heard Hale's voice. Vasquez. She turned. He was at the head of Bay 1, his patient stabilized, his eyes on her. What are you doing? Preparing to move this patient to surgery. Intra-abdominal hemorrhage. Falling pressure. He's going to code if he doesn't go now. I haven't assessed him. There isn't time for you to assess him. His last BP was 68/38. She paused 1 beat. Doctor. The pause was deliberate. She held his gaze. Hale crossed the space in 4 steps and looked at the ultrasound image still on the screen. He looked at the patient. He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. Move him, he said. The patient went to OR2 at 2:41 p.m. The surgical team met them at the elevator. Over the next 40 minutes, 7 more patients arrived. 3 were critical. 2 were expectant. The triage category nobody wanted to use, the one that meant resources went elsewhere because the math was too brutal for emotion. Norah made both of those calls without being asked, and she made them correctly, and she did not look away from either patient when she did it. The department ran. Imperfectly. There were moments of confusion, one supply mix-up that cost 3 minutes, a communication failure between the lab and the floor that she caught before it became something worse. But it ran. At 3:20 p.m., a brief lull in the incoming wave allowed her to breathe for the first time in nearly an hour. She was at the supply station, gloves off, running a quick inventory, when Sandra appeared beside her. You want to know what Hale said to Prakash about you just now? Norah kept counting gauze packs. Not particularly. He said, she got lucky with the call on the abdominal. Don't let her think that passes for clinical reasoning. The gauze count didn't pause. Okay. Norah. Sandra, He's going to put more in your file. Today. I overheard him on the phone with administration. Sandra's voice was low and direct. He's calling it unilateral decision-making that circumvents physician authority. Those are the words. Norah set down the supply count. She stood very still for a moment. She had made the right call. She knew she had made the right call. The patient was in surgery, alive, with a reasonable chance of staying that way. That was the outcome. That was the only outcome that mattered, and it was still going to be used against her. I'll deal with it, she said. I know you will. I'm just... Sandra hesitated, which was unusual. She was not a person who hesitated. I'm worried about you, not about your competence, about what happens to competent people in places that don't want to see it. Norah looked at her. I've been in places like that before. Yeah? Sandra studied her face. What kind of places? A beat. Different kind, Norah said. The second wave of ambulances arrived at 3:34 p.m. and the lull was over. This wave was different. The paramedics' radio traffic ahead of arrival had been fragmented, almost, reluctant, which was not a word Norah usually applied to paramedics. When the first unit pulled in, the crew's faces were tight in a way that read less like exhaustion and more like something they hadn't fully processed yet. What are we looking at? Norah met them at the bay doors. The lead paramedic, a woman named Torres, whose name she'd learned over 4 months of shift overlap, pulled her aside while her partner managed the gurney. This one's different, Torres said quietly. The scene wasn't what they called it in initially. No accident. The vehicles were targeted, coordinated, not road rage. Witnesses described 2 separate vehicles running the convoy off the road, then guys on foot with rifles. She paused. The cops are saying something about a witness transport gone wrong. A federal thing. Norah absorbed this. How many more coming? 2 more critical from this group, but there's something else. Torres glanced toward the ambulance bay entrance, then back. There's a vehicle about 10 minutes out, not one of ours, military plates. They reached out to dispatch and asked which hospital was handling the primary. Military. Yeah, make of that what you will. Torres moved back to her gurney. Norah moved inside. The patient from this wave was the most critical yet. A man in his mid-50s, consciousness flickering, with blast injuries to his lower legs and a secondary wound to his left shoulder that suggested he'd been in the initial vehicle when the ambush started. He was also, she noticed, not in the clothing pattern of the other patients. Small detail. The kind that wouldn't show up in most triage decisions. She filed it. Hale was in Bay 1, still, with a patient they were losing despite everything. She could hear his voice changing register. Not panicking, but tightening, the way voices did when the math stopped working. The man in front of her was her problem. Talk to me, she said to the patient, low and direct. Can you hear me? His eyes opened. Not fully, but enough. He was in significant pain, which tracked, but what she saw underneath the pain was something she recognized from other contexts. He was assessing her. Even half-conscious, the calculation in those eyes was active. Where, he started. Harlo Creek General, Wyoming. You're in the emergency department. I'm your nurse. I'm going to take care of you, but I need you to stay with me. She had her hands on his legs, reading the injuries. The blast damage was survivable, painful, complicated, but survivable. The shoulder wound was the one she didn't like. Did you lose consciousness in the field? Don't... a breath. Don't let anyone in this room until you know who they are. She paused, looked at him. There are more of them, he said. His eyes were clearer than they had any right to be. They'll follow. They know where the transport was going. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she said, Understood, and stood up and looked at the bay doors and thought about what Torres had just told her, and about the military vehicle 10 minutes out, and about the pattern of wounds she'd seen across all the patients in the last hour. Sandra, she called across the room. Her voice was level. No urgency signal in it at all. Can you get me the direct line for hospital security? And tell them I want to know about any vehicles on the property that aren't patient transport, Any vehicles at all. Sandra looked at her, read something in the request that went past the words. On it. Nora turned back to her patient. The next 17 minutes were strictly medical. Stabilizing his pressure, managing the leg injuries, getting the wound cleaned and dressed with an efficiency she didn't explain and nobody asked about. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he surfaced, he looked at her with that same calculating awareness, like he was rechecking a conclusion he'd already reached. At 3:58 p.m., she heard the military vehicle. It was a sound she recognized before she could explain the recognition. The specific weight of a government-issue transport, the way the engine sat, the deliberate pace of a vehicle moving through a space rather than into one. And then the bay doors opened. 4 men, military bearing, civilian clothes, the kind of thing that read federal to anyone who knew the signals. They had identifications already out before they reached the nurse's station. And the one in front, late 30s, a vertical scar through one eyebrow, the stillness of someone who had learned to move quietly through places he didn't fully trust, scanned the room once and found Norah in approximately 2 seconds. He moved toward her directly. Hale stepped into his path. This is a restricted medical area. If you have a patient, we're here for one of yours. The man's ID said Federal Protective Service, but his eyes said something with more letters. Our information indicates you received a patient in the last 30 minutes, male, mid-50s, blast and GSW injuries. Patient information is confidential, Hale said. If you have proper federal... Marcus, it was Nora's voice. Not loud, not sharp, just certain. The word landed like something set down on a table rather than thrown. Hale turned and looked at her. They have the right documentation, she said, and they need to be in the room. You don't get to make that determination. No, she said, but you do. And you should look at the ID again before you decide. Something in her voice, not the content of it, but the specific quality of the certainty in it, made Hale look, and look again, and take a half step back. The man with the scar turned to Norah. His expression shifted. Not much. The stillness didn't break, but there was something that moved behind his eyes. Recognition and something more complicated than surprise. You're the nurse, he said. I'm the nurse, she confirmed. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, in a voice that was not performing anything for the room, that was simply stating a thing that was true. We've been trying to find you for 8 months. From the far end of the department, someone called out a BP reading. A monitor alarmed. The controlled noise of the emergency room continued around them, indifferent. Nora Vasquez stood at the center of it and said nothing, and her face was the same face it had been all day. Calm, unremarkable, present. And only someone who knew what to look for would have seen the thing that moved behind her eyes when he said that. The thing that looked less like surprise and more like inevitability. He didn't move toward her. He didn't reach out a hand or produce a folder or do any of the things people did when they wanted to establish authority in a room. He just stood there and let the statement exist and waited to see what she did with it. What she did was turn back to her patient. His pressure has been stabilizing over the last 8 minutes, she said, pulling off one glove to check the IV line. The leg wounds are dressed and cleaned. The shoulder is more complicated. There's fragmentation I wasn't able to fully assess without imaging, and I'm concerned about subclavian proximity. He needs a CT before anyone moves him anywhere. The man with the scar, she didn't have his name yet, which was a gap she noted and didn't fill, came to stand on the opposite side of the gurney. He looked at the patient with the particular flatness of someone who had looked at injured people in high-stakes situations many times before. Rourke, the patient said. His eyes were open again, aimed at the ceiling. His voice was rough but precise. Stand down. Sir, she's handling it. A pause for breath. Let her handle it. Rourke, that was the scar man's name, apparently, said nothing. He stepped back 2 feet, not out of the room, not away from the gurney, just back enough to stop being an obstacle, and Norah noted the specific discipline it took to do that, and filed it with everything else she'd filed in the last 20 minutes. She moved to the imaging request terminal. Hale materialized at her shoulder. She'd heard him coming. The rhythm of his footsteps was recognizable by now, quicker and harder when he was irritated, and she kept her eyes on the screen. "You want to explain to me what just happened out there," he said, low and tight. "I told you to look at the documentation again." "I looked at it. It said Federal Protective Service." "Right. That's not sufficient justification for Dr. Hale." She submitted the imaging request and turned to face him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lower it. She simply made her face do the thing it did when she needed a conversation to stop going sideways. "The patient asked me to allow them in the room, which is the patient's right. And the documentation clears federal authorization. That's the reasoning. There isn't more reasoning than that." He looked at her for a long moment. "You knew something. When you told me to look again, you knew what that was." "I knew you were about to refuse entry to a federal protective unit, and that it was going to become a problem in about 30 seconds. "And how did you know that?" She held his gaze. "Experience." The word sat there between them, and for once in 4 months, Marcus Hale had no immediate follow-up. He was a man whose professional identity was built on knowing more than the people around him, on the gap between his expertise and everyone else's being wide enough to justify the distance he kept. And something in the way she said that word, not as a credential, not as a challenge, just as a simple fact like water is wet, made the gap feel less certain than he was used to. He walked away without responding. Norah turned back to the patient. The CT happened at 4:11 p.m. She pushed the gurney herself, Rourke on the opposite side, the other 3 federal agents maintaining a perimeter in a way that was professionally invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. The imaging suite was quiet. The tech on duty, a 20-year-old named Will, who asked 0 questions and pulled the images in under 8 minutes. The subclavian artery was intact. The fragmentation had stopped approximately 11 millimeters short. She looked at the image and breathed out once, privately. "He needs surgical washout on the shoulder," she told Rourke. "The fragmentation has to come out under controlled conditions. You can't leave it, but the critical pressure's off. He's stable enough to be moved if you need to move him." "We don't move him yet." Rourke was studying the same image over her shoulder. He had clearly looked at medical imaging before, which was another data point she collected. "Not until we know the perimeter is clear." "Clear from what?" He looked at her sideways, just his eyes moving, not his head. "The people who put him in this hospital in the first place." She'd known the shape of this since Torres told her about the highway, since the patient told her not to let anyone in the room until she knew who they were, since the wound patterns that didn't match any accident she'd ever seen, and she had seen a number of accidents and a number of things that weren't accidents. She said, "I want to know what we're dealing with, all of it, not the version that's been edited for civilian medical staff." Rourke studied her for a moment. "Why?" "Because I need to know how to protect my patients and my staff, and I can't do that operating on half information." She met his eyes directly. "And because I've operated in situations like this before, and I don't make bad decisions faster when people condescend to me." Another beat. "You were 75th Ranger Regiment," he said. It was not a question. "I was. Combat medic, 2 deployments. Third one ended at Savar Ridge." He said the name carefully, the way people said names of places where bad things happened. Not with drama, but with a kind of precise respect that acknowledged the weight without performing it. "After that you separated and went off the grid for 14 months before showing up in nursing school in Colorado." She said nothing. She looked at the CT images. "Your service record is classified above my clearance level," he said, "which is not a common thing, which is why it took us 8 months. You've been thorough. The man on that table asked us to be." Rourke turned to face her fully. "His name is Walter Greer. He's a former senior procurement officer at the Department of Defense, and he has been cooperating with a federal investigation for the last 19 months. The evidence he's been building will directly implicate 14 defense contractors and 7 currently active DoD officials in a fraud operation that diverted over $2 billion in military equipment contracts. Not padding invoices. Not bureaucratic skimming. Equipment that was supposed to go to deployed units, medical supplies, communications gear, vehicle armor, getting redirected and sold to private buyers in 4 countries." He let that sit for a second. The convoy on Highway 34 was supposed to be untraceable. The people behind this found the route anyway. Norah looked at Greer through the imaging suite glass. He was still, eyes closed now, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a man who had decided to let his body rest while his mind stayed ready. The people who attacked the convoy, she said, they know he's here. They will within the next 2 hours, probably less. And your unit. 4 operators and me. We were the close protection team. We lost 2 in the ambush. His voice was flat when he said it. The flatness of someone who would feel it later, in a different place, and knew it. The additional resources I've requested are en route, but we're looking at minimum 4 hours, possibly 6. She did the math on that. It wasn't pleasant math. The hospital, she said. The layout. I'll need someone who knows it. He looked at her. I'm asking. She turned away from the window. Give me 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes looked from the outside like Nora Vasquez doing a supply run. She moved through the department with her usual unremarkable pace, restocking cart, checking rooms, stopping to exchange a word with 2 nurses. What she was actually doing was something quite different. She was mapping. She'd done it before at, not hospitals, but buildings, compounds, forward operating positions in unfamiliar terrain. The process was the same: entry points, sight lines, choke points, the places where a defensive perimeter was strong and the places where it wasn't. The ER had 4 external access points she could identify immediately. The main ambulance bay, the staff entrance on the south side, the main lobby corridor that connected to the rest of the hospital, and the freight elevator bank in the east wing that most of the clinical staff didn't think about because it was where the housekeeping and laundry carts moved. That last one was the problem. It was largely unmonitored outside of a single aging camera that she knew from personal observation only covered about 60% of the corridor. She came back to Rourke with this information delivered in under 2 minutes, clean and organized, no editorializing. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The freight elevator." "Yes." "Can you get it locked down?" "I can get the access codes changed. I know who to call. But I need a reason that doesn't cause a general panic in the building, because a panic is worse than a vulnerability right now. It puts patients in motion, and patients in motion are harder to protect." "Equipment malfunction," he said immediately. "Call it a mechanical issue." "That works?" She pulled out her phone. "What else do you need from me?" "Right now?" "Just keep doing what you're doing." He paused. "And don't tell Dr. Hale more than he needs to know." She almost showed something on her face. Instead, she said, "I wasn't planning to." She was halfway through the call to facilities when the department shifted. It was the kind of shift that didn't have a single source. Not one alarm, not one specific event, but a change in air pressure that emergency workers learned to read before they learned to explain it. Sandra was moving faster than she'd been moving. Prakash looked up from a chart, with his head angled toward something Norah couldn't see yet. One of the federal agents near the lobby entrance had changed his stance in a way that added approximately 2 inches to his height. She ended the call, turned. The man coming through the main lobby doors was wearing the same kind of civilian clothing as Rourke's people. Medium height, compact build, moving with the specific economy of someone who'd decided exactly what he was going to do before he walked through the door. He had a visitor's lanyard, the kind the front desk handed out, which meant he'd stopped to get one, which meant he wanted to look like he belonged. He was already past the lobby desk, already in the corridor toward the ER. Rourke's nearest agent had clocked him and was closing the distance from the left side, but slowly. In a crowded hospital corridor, escalating quickly meant bystanders, meant a different kind of problem. Norah was closer. She stepped into the corridor and said, "Sir, can I help you find someone?" He stopped, looked at her. The look lasted approximately 1 second too long. "I'm looking for the emergency department," he said. "Are you here as a patient or visiting?" "Visiting." "Name of the patient?" He produced a name, generic, unhelpful. His eyes were already moving past her, cataloging the department beyond. "I'll need to check that for you," she said. She positioned herself in his direct line of sight, not blocking, not confrontational, just present in a way that required him to deal with her before he dealt with anything else. She had her tablet in her hands, looking down at it. "Can you spell the last name for me?" He spelled it. She took her time with the screen. 8 seconds, 10, 12. Each second was a second for Rourke's agent to get into position, a second for the man with the lanyard to commit more fully to a story, a second for her to read his tells. He was watching the federal agent move into position behind him. He'd already clocked it. His right hand moved toward his jacket. "Actually," Norah said, and her voice was exactly the same as it had been all day. That same neutral, unremarkable register. "I don't think you're here to see a patient." He looked at her, really looked at her. She saw the calculation in it. What he didn't see, because most people didn't, was that she had already made every decision she needed to make. When he moved, she was ready. It wasn't a long fight. They weren't. His reach was longer, but he was moving into her space, and that was his mistake. And she'd been taught in contexts that didn't believe in finishing in second place how to use someone's forward momentum against them. The agent reached them 2 seconds later, and the man with the lanyard was on the floor with a knee in his back and his right arm at an angle that he would feel for the next 3 weeks. The corridor was briefly, completely still. Then 3 nurses started talking at once. A patient in a wheelchair rolled forward and then backward, and Prakash made a noise somewhere between a question and a statement that didn't quite resolve into either. Rourke was there. He had zip restraints out. The kind from a cargo pocket, not a duty belt, which told her something. And he handed them to his agent without looking at him, his eyes on Norah. "He's carrying," she said. "I see it." She stepped back, smoothed her scrub top. Her hands were steady. "That's going to be in a report somewhere," she said. "Probably." Rourke straightened up. His expression was the same as it had been, controlled, reading. But there was something different in his eyes now, a recalibration. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "You're bleeding." He nodded toward her forearm. She looked down, a shallow scrape along the inside of her left forearm. He'd caught her with something, a ring or a watch face. She hadn't fully registered it. She looked at it with the detached assessment of someone who had bled in more inconvenient places. "It's nothing," she said. "Put a bandage on it." "I know how to dress a wound." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to his mouth, but it tried. "I know you do. I'm saying do it before you walk back into your department, because 3 of your staff are watching you right now, and you're their charge and you need to look like things are under control." She glanced back. He was right. Sandra, Prakash, 2 of the day shift nurses, all of them trying to look like they were doing something else. None of them doing it convincingly. She went to the supply room. She dressed the wound in about 90 seconds. When she came back out, she stopped at the nurses' station long enough to say, "Security incident in the corridor. It's being handled. We have federal personnel assisting. Everyone continue your work." Sandra said very quietly, "Norah, what is happening right now?" "There are people coming who are targeting one of our patients. The federal team is here to protect him and us." She kept her voice low and direct. No soft-off-siphoning, no performance of calm, just the information. "We're going to continue to treat our patients. We're going to do our jobs. But I need you to know that the situation outside this department may escalate." Sandra looked at her for a long moment. The 22 years of emergency nursing sat behind her eyes, all the things she'd seen, all the times things had not been what they first appeared to be. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Tell me which staff members are going to hold and which ones are going to have a reaction." Sandra didn't hesitate. "Prakash is going to spiral. Jamie and Torres are solid. The 2-day nurses from the second wave are wildcards, but probably fine." "Okay," Norah thought fast. "Give Prakash the most routine patient in the department right now and keep him busy, hands-on, something he knows. Don't let him stand around with time to think." "Done," Sandra paused. "And you?" "I'm going to talk to Hale." Sandra's expression shifted. Not quite disbelief, but the specific look of someone adjusting expectations rapidly. "Good luck." Hale was in his office, which was a generous word for the 8x10 room behind the department with the perpetually overflowing desk and the single window that looked at a concrete wall. He was on the phone when she knocked and opened the door without waiting. He lowered the phone. "I'm in the middle of, I need 2 minutes. You should take them." Something in her delivery made him end the call. He set down the phone and crossed his arms and looked at her with the expression he reserved for things he hadn't figured out how to be dismissive about yet. She told him what he needed to know. Not all of it. Rourke was right that some of it wasn't his to have, but the operational shape of it. Targeted patient, federal protection detail, potential secondary threat to the facility. She laid it out in about 90 seconds, clean and unembellished. He was quiet for a moment. In 4 months, she had not seen Marcus Hale quiet for more than 3 seconds at a stretch. "You're telling me this hospital is a potential target," he said. "One patient is a confirmed target. The hospital is incidentally at risk as a result." "And you knew when those agents walked in?" "I suspected." "How?" She held his gaze. "I know what federal close protection teams look like." "From where?" She didn't answer that. She watched him do the arithmetic on that non-answer and come up short, and for the first time in 4 months, she saw him encounter a version of Nora Vasquez that he had no framework for. "The administration," he started, "should be notified carefully in a way that doesn't trigger a building evacuation, because a patient and staff exodus right now would create chaos in the parking structure that would benefit exactly the wrong people. That's Rourke's call, but my recommendation is to give him another 30 minutes before we escalate to building-level protocols." He looked at her for a long time. "You have an opinion on federal security protocols," he said. "I have experience that makes those opinions relevant." "What experience?" "Military," she said. "Combat. 8 years." Another silence. This one had a different quality. Not the silence of a man organizing a rebuttal, but of a man recalibrating an entire map. "You're a combat veteran," he said. "Yes." "And a medic." "Qualified." "Yes." He looked at his desk, at something on his desk that he wasn't seeing, then back at her. "The patient you called for surgery at 2:41. The abdominal bleed." "Yes." "That wasn't luck." "No." He breathed out through his nose. She recognized it. The specific exhale of someone releasing a position they'd been holding longer than was comfortable. "What do you need from me right now?" he said. His voice was different, not warm. Marcus Hale did not do warm, probably hadn't for a long time, but stripped of the performance. Just the question. "Lock down your patient census. No new visitors cleared without going through the federal agents first. Nobody goes in or out of Bay 7, which is where Greer is staged. And if someone you don't recognize tries to enter this department with an explanation that sounds reasonable, I call you. You call Rourke. His number is in my phone. I'll text it to you." She paused at the door. "And if I give you an order in the next few hours and I don't have time to explain it, I'll follow it." He said it before she finished. Then, "On a case-by-case basis." She almost smiled. "Understood, doctor." She left him with that and went back to the floor. The next hour was deceptive. It had the surface texture of a normal late afternoon in the ER. Patients being treated, orders being written, the background noise of a working hospital doing its work. Underneath it, a different architecture was in motion. Rourke's people repositioned twice. She helped them understand the timing of the staff shift rotations, the rhythm of which corridors went quiet, and when, the 3-minute window every half hour, when the south entrance was monitored by a single desk staffer who took their break at irregular intervals. She also kept doing her job. Greer was awake and alert by 5:30 p.m. She was in Bay 7 checking his vitals when he said, "Rourke told me what happened in the corridor. It was handled. He said you didn't wait for backup." There wasn't time to wait. He watched her check the IV line. His eyes had the same quality as before, active, assessing, the intelligence of someone who had spent years in rooms where information was the only real currency. "You know what I did," he said. "What Rourke told you." "Yes." "And?" She glanced up. "And what?" Most people, when they find out what I'm testifying about, what was diverted, what units went without because of contracts I signed off on, they have a reaction. She looked at him directly. "Units in the field went without equipment they needed." "Yes." "Because of a procurement chain you were part of." "Yes." "I was part of it before I understood the full scope, and then I cooperated with investigators because I had evidence that nobody else had." He held her gaze. "That's not an excuse. It's a sequence." She thought about equipment that hadn't been there when it should have been. about specific moments in specific places that she would not describe out loud in this room or any room. "I know the difference between an excuse and a sequence," she said. He nodded slowly. "You were downrange." "Yes." "I'm sorry," he said. It was a plain statement, no performance in it. She looked at his blood pressure reading. "I know," she said. And then, "Your pressure is good. Try to rest." She stepped out of Bay 7 at 5:47 p.m. At 5:52, the power went out. Not a brownout, not a flicker. A full cut, sudden and complete, that took the fluorescent lights and the equipment displays and the ambient electronic hum of a working hospital and dropped them into a darkness that lasted 3 seconds before the emergency generators kicked in. The backup power restored about 60% of the lighting and kept the critical equipment running, but the security system was on a separate circuit and it came back wrong. She could see it on the panel by the nurse's station, indicators that should have been green sitting amber. In the darkness of those 3 seconds, she heard her own heartbeat twice. Then the generators came up and she was already moving toward Rourke, who was already moving toward her, and they met in the middle of the department with the same conclusion already reached independently. "The security cameras," she said, 40% are down, including the south entrance and the freight bank. His voice was controlled but close to the edge of it. This wasn't a power issue. Someone cut the main relay deliberately. She ran the building layout in her head. South entrance, freight bank, both dark. The lobby still had backup coverage. The ambulance bay had its own generator circuit. That left the loading dock, she said, east side below the freight elevator. There's a maintenance access point that connects directly to the basement corridor under the ER. It's not on the primary security map. It was added in a 2019 renovation, and the signage was never updated. Rourke stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I read the building schematics on my second week here. Habit." "Where does the corridor come out?" "Supply room C, 30 feet from Bay 7. For a half second, something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite respect moved across Rourke's face. Then he was on his radio, clipped and fast, repositioning his people. 2 of his agents moved toward the supply room. She moved with them. "Stay behind," the near agent started. "Supply room C has a secondary door that opens inward and a layout that you don't know, and I do," she said, not breaking stride. "I'm behind you, not in front, but I'm coming." The agent looked at Rourke. Rourke gave a short nod. They moved. The basement corridor was cold and smelled of concrete and old pipe insulation. The emergency lighting down here was minimal. A strip of yellow-orange along the floor, shadows at every corner. The maintenance access point Norah had described was a steel door set into the east wall, and when they reached supply room C and she pointed to the secondary entrance on the south wall, both agents moved to flank it. She positioned herself to the right of the door frame, back to the wall. Silence. 15 seconds. 30. Then, from the other side of the door, a sound. Controlled footsteps. 2 sets, moving deliberately. The agents exchanged a glance. The door handle moved. She held still. The door swung inward fast, too fast, the move of someone who'd decided that momentum was better than stealth. And the first figure through was already raising something in his right hand when the nearer agent took him down, and the second agent moved to the doorframe for the second figure. Norah was watching the corridor behind them, because 2 sets of footsteps was what she'd counted, but 3 doors existed on the maintenance access route, and the math only added up if all of them had come the same way. She turned toward the secondary corridor exit. A third figure was already inside. He was moving fast and quiet, and he had a clear path to the door that led to the ER floor, and in 4 seconds he was going to be through it and 30 feet from Walter Greer's room with 2 of Rourke's 4 remaining agents tied up behind her. She had approximately 2 of those 4 seconds. She didn't call out. She didn't warn. She'd been in enough situations to know that warning someone who's committed is just giving them a target location. She moved. He was bigger than the man in the corridor earlier. She read that immediately and adjusted. And he got his arm up before she could control it, which meant the first 2 seconds were worse than she'd have liked. Her back hit a supply shelf. Something glass fell and shattered. He was trying to get past her, not neutralize her, which was information. She wasn't his objective. She was an obstacle. That meant he'd disengage if he could, which meant she had to make disengaging costly enough that he'd still be here when Rourke's people reached them. She made it costly. By the time the second agent came through the door, the third intruder was on the ground and Norah was breathing harder than she'd have chosen to admit, her shoulder at an angle that was going to need attention, and a supply cart overturned against the far wall. The agent looked at the man on the floor, looked at her, said nothing. She straightened up. 3 total. Are there more? Rourke's checking the perimeter now. The agent was already on his radio. She pressed her back to the wall and let herself take 2 full breaths. Her shoulder was not good. She rotated it once, carefully, and decided it was functional and filed the pain away for later in the same drawer where she filed everything that didn't help her in the present moment. From down the corridor, Rourke's voice on the radio. Perimeter check in progress. I need a head count on all staff and patients. All positions report. She pushed off the wall. 30 feet, Bay 7, Greer. She went. The Bay 7 door was closed the way she'd left it. She pushed it open and the room was dark. Backup power hadn't fully restored this section, and she stood in the doorway for the half second it took her eyes to adjust. And in that half second, she heard breathing. 2 people, the wrong number, and the room resolved out of the shadow, and Walter Greer was sitting up in the hospital bed with his hands visible, and a man she had never seen before was standing behind him with one arm across his chest and a weapon in his other hand pressed to the side of his neck. The man looked at her. She looked at him. "Walk away," he said. She stepped into the room and let the door swing shut behind her. The man behind Greer was patient. That was the first thing she read. He wasn't vibrating with adrenaline, wasn't scanning the room in the frantic way of someone who'd improvised this. He'd waited in here. He'd known which room, which patient, and he'd gotten in before the power cut, which meant the power cut wasn't his entry. It was his signal to his people in the corridor to move. He was the one who was supposed to finish it while they created noise. She stayed at the door. "Walk away," he said again. Flat. Professional. "I can't do that." "Then you're going to watch." Greer's face was controlled, which took effort given his position. Arm across his chest, weapon at his neck, the shoulder wound she'd cleaned 2 hours ago putting him at a disadvantage he couldn't entirely suppress. But his eyes were on Norah, and they were calm. Not the calm of resignation, the calm of someone waiting to see what the next move was. She made herself read the room completely before she did anything else. Her shoulder was compromised. She didn't have a weapon. The man was positioned behind Greer with the bed as partial cover, which meant any approach from the front was geometrically bad. The room had a secondary supply cabinet on the right wall, a cardiac monitor on a rolling stand, and a blood pressure cuff hanging off the rail of the bed. None of that was immediately useful. What was useful was the cardiac monitor. It was still running on backup power. She could see the green trace from where she stood, Greer's heart rate tracking steady at 88, higher than resting, not catastrophic. "You don't have a way out of this building," she said. It wasn't a taunt. She said it the way she'd say a blood pressure reading, as information delivered straight. "The corridor team is down. The perimeter's being closed right now. Your exit route through the maintenance access is gone." A small pause. "Then I don't need a way out. I just need 30 seconds. If you fire that weapon in this room, you're not going to get 30 seconds. You're going to get 4 federal agents in this doorway, and whatever life you had before tonight ends in a hospital bay 7. My life already ended." He said it without drama, which was somehow worse than if he'd performed it. "I'm getting paid regardless of what happens to me after." She believed him. That was the problem. The professionals who were most dangerous in situations like this were not the ones who wanted to survive. It was the ones who'd made a separate peace with the question. She shifted her weight. He tracked it. Fast. "Don't," he said. She stopped. Her shoulder was talking to her in a way that was going to constrain her options. She had maybe 60% of what she'd normally have on that side, which was enough for some things and not enough for others. Greer spoke. "What's your name?" he said. The man behind him didn't answer. "I'm asking because you're going to be in a room with me for the next few minutes, and I'd rather know who I'm talking to. Shut up." "I've been doing this work for 19 months, Greer said. His voice was rough but measured. He was managing his breathing carefully. She could see it, keeping his chest movement minimal so the arm across it didn't shift the angle of the weapon. I've talked to people who were paid to end the investigation, people who thought I was the problem. You're not the first, and you probably won't be the last. A pause. But I'm going to ask you to look at the woman standing at the door, and I want you to really look at her, and I want you to think about whether this is actually how you want this to end. The man looked at Norah. She looked back. What he saw, she knew, was a nurse in scrubs with a bandaged forearm and dark circles under her eyes from a shift that had started 11 hours ago. What he was missing was everything underneath that surface, the same thing everyone in this building had been missing for 4 months. She's nobody, he said. Greer almost smiled. Even in this position, even with a weapon at his neck, the corner of his mouth did something. That's what I thought, he said. Right up until Norah moved, not at him, at the cardiac monitor. She grabbed the rolling stand and shoved it hard into the space between them, and she didn't stop moving. She was already going right, getting off the line, using the 2 seconds of visual disruption the stand created. He fired. The sound in the enclosed space was enormous, a physical thing that hit her in the chest, and the round went into the wall 8 inches left of where she'd been standing. She reached him in the same second she reached Greer. Her good shoulder hit first. She drove into his weapon arm, controlling the barrel, taking the impact of the arm across Greer's chest as collateral, because there was no clean version of this, and she'd known that from the door. The weapon discharged again, sealing, and then Rourke was in the room, and then it was over in the way these things ended when the numbers changed, fast, ugly, and permanent. The man went down. His weapon was on the floor. Rourke had him. Norah was already checking Greer. I'm fine, he said immediately. You're not the one who decides that. She had her hands on his chest and shoulder, running the assessment. The IV line had come partially out in the disruption. She reseated it. The shoulder wound dressing was intact. His pulse was elevated, 112, but his color was okay, and his breathing was controlled. Does anything hurt that didn't hurt before? My dignity, he said. I'll chart that as non-urgent. She pressed 2 fingers to his radial pulse and counted. Strong. You did well. I bought you about 12 seconds. 12 seconds is a lot. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. It is. Rourke zip-tied the man on the floor and then stood up and looked at Norah and said, Your shoulder. It's functional. That's not what I asked. It's what I'm offering. She pulled back from Greer's bedside and put weight through the shoulder experimentally. It wasn't good. It was also not dislocated. She'd had a dislocated shoulder before, in a context she wasn't going to explain in this room, and this was a different category of bad. Probable AC joint, maybe a muscle tear, functional for now, a problem for later. How many were there total? 5 confirmed, all down. He checked his radio. Perimeter team reports no further contacts. Additional federal units are 90 minutes out. The building. Secure as of 6 minutes ago. He looked at her directly. You took the room alone. I took the room with 12 seconds of distraction from my patient. You were unarmed and your shoulder was already injured. I was aware of those conditions. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. The thing behind his eyes had been recalibrating all afternoon, and she could see it land somewhere different now. More settled, like a question that had been open for 8 months finally closing. There's a debrief coming, he said. When reinforcements arrive, the investigators are going to want your statement. I know. They're also going to want to know who you are, the full record, not the version on your nursing license. She absorbed that. I understand. He nodded once. Then he moved to secure the room. She stood in the doorway of Bay 7 for a moment, in the low amber light of the backup power, and she let herself have approximately 4 seconds of nothing. Not calm, exactly. Her heart rate was still elevated and her shoulder was making itself known in increasingly specific terms, and the sound of that first gunshot was still reverberating in some part of her auditory processing that adrenaline hadn't fully dampened, just 4 seconds of existing in the space between one thing ending and the next thing beginning. Then she went back to work. The ER had not been idle while Bay 7 was happening. She understood that before she reached the nurse's station, she could read it in Sandra's face, in the controlled urgency of the staff movement, and the fact that two of the gurneys she'd left in staging positions were in different locations. "What happened?" she said. Sandra's voice was low and very direct. "Trauma in Bay 2. Came in 20 minutes ago, one of the highway patients who'd been discharged to a step-down room upstairs and came back down complaining of pain. Dr. Hale started him on a workup, but his pressure's been dropping for the last 8 minutes, and..." She paused. "Hale's losing him." Norah moved. Bay 2 was a contained crisis in progress. Hale was there with Prakash and a nurse she didn't know well, a travel nurse named Brianna, who'd been pulled from another floor. The patient was a man in his early 40s, the same dark clothing pattern she'd noted in the initial wave, another vehicle from the convoy, and his face was the gray-white color of someone whose vascular system was negotiating with gravity and losing. She read the monitor. BP 74/48 and falling. Heart rate 134. The line on the cardiac display had the specific shape of a compensating system running out of room. Hale looked up when she came in. There was something different in his face than there had been this morning, or any of the mornings before it. The architecture of his expression when he looked at her had changed. "Pressure's not responding to the second fluid bolus," he said, without preamble, without the usual register of a physician informing a subordinate, like he was talking to a colleague. "I'm thinking internal hemorrhage, but the imaging from intake didn't show it." "When was the imaging?" 3 hours ago." "Things move." She pulled on gloves and went to the bedside. "He was ambulatory upstairs?" "Walking, talking, mild pain, standard discharge criteria." "Slow bleeds don't always show in 3 hours." She had her hands on his abdomen. The rigidity was subtle, but there, a guarding pattern she recognized. Same pattern as the 241 patient. Different vessel, same mechanism. He was in the convoy. Hale said, "The blast force." "Deceleration injury. The initial imaging was clean enough to pass, but the vessel wall was compromised. It's been leaking slowly, and now it isn't slow anymore. OR 2 is still occupied." "Then we get OR 3. OR 3 hasn't been..." "Then we set it up. Right now." She turned. "Brianna, I need you to get OR 3 staffed in the next 4 minutes. Call the surgical coordinator directly. Tell them it's an emergency activation. Tell them Dr. Hale is requesting. Go now." Brianna went. Hale was quiet for a second. "You know OR activation protocols." "I've worked in a lot of different configurations." She was managing the patient's airway positioning, adjusting the bed angle. "We need another unit of O-neg." "Already called." She looked at him. "Good." For the next 6 minutes, they worked the patient together, and it was the first time in 4 months that it felt like a team instead of a hierarchy. Not perfect. Hale still over-explained 2 things he didn't need to explain, and she cut him off once on a medication order that she was right about, and he acknowledged it a beat late, but functional. The patient's pressure stabilized at 80 systolic, which was not good, but was enough to move. The OR elevator opened at 4:58 p.m. with OR 3 declared ready at 4:56. When the gurney cleared the doors and Hale moved to scrub in, he stopped and looked back at her. She expected something, a thank you structured to minimize what it cost him, or a deferred acknowledgement, the kind of thing people said when they needed to give credit without fully meaning it. He said, "I've been wrong about you since the first week." She said, "You weren't wrong about everything. Some of it was an honest read based on incomplete information." He looked at her like she'd surprised him. "You're generous with that." "I'm practical with it." She held his gaze. "Go operate." He went. She stood outside the elevator doors for a moment. Her shoulder was now loudly, specifically angry. She put her back against the wall and breathed and did the honest assessment. A C-joint sprain, probably grade 2, possibly 3. Rotator cuff involvement she couldn't rule out. She needed imaging, which was one of those sentences that sat badly when you were the only person available to do certain things, and imaging took time you didn't currently have. She went back to the department instead. Rourke found her at the nurse's station at 5:20 p.m. He had a look she hadn't seen from him before. Not tight, exactly, but focused in the particular way of someone who'd just received new information. "The debrief just moved up," he said, Lead investigator is 40 minutes out instead of 90. Why? Because of what we pulled off the men from the corridor. He kept his voice down, even in the depleted department. They were carrying something we weren't expecting. Communications equipment. Encrypted, but our technical team says the encryption is DoD standard. She looked at him. Someone on the inside of the federal investigation routed information to the people who planned the convoy ambush, he said. Someone with clearance. Someone who knew the route, the timing, and which hospital was receiving. She worked through the implications of that. The lead investigator. We don't know yet who it is. We know it's someone with access to the case file, which narrows it to... He stopped, recalibrated. Which narrows it to a small number of people. Including people who are en route here right now. Yes. She said nothing for a moment. Rourke's face was doing the thing it did when he was working through a problem that had no clean solution. She recognized it because she'd made the same face in different places. The evidence Greer has, she said. Where is it? Secured, but the investigator who's en route has case clearance, which means... A sound from the direction of Bay 7 interrupted them. Not a gunshot. Not a scream. Just a sound that didn't belong. A specific interruption in the ambient background of a recovering hospital floor. The kind of thing you only heard if you'd trained yourself to listen under noise. Norah turned. The Bay 7 door was open. It had been closed when she walked away from it. Rourke had secured the room. Both of them had come directly here. They moved at the same time. The room was empty. Not empty. Wrong. The bed was there. The equipment was there. The signs of recent occupation were there. But Walter Greer was not in the bed. The IV line was on the floor, neatly disconnected rather than pulled. The cardiac monitor leads were removed with the specific care of someone who knew that a sudden flatline alarm would bring people running. On the bed, there was a single item, a folded piece of paper. Rourke picked it up, unfolded it, read it. His face didn't change, but his jaw set in a way she'd learned to read as the suppressed version of something larger. He turned the paper so she could see it. 4 words, handwritten, in the deliberate block print of someone who'd wanted it to be legible. They know about Rourke. Rourke read the note a second time, not because he needed to. The words were 4, simple, and the meaning was not ambiguous, but because he was the kind of person who didn't act on the first read of something when he had 1 additional second to use. Then he folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket and said, "Tell me who's had access to this room in the last 20 minutes. You, me, your 2 agents. Nobody else came through this corridor?" Sandra was at the station the entire time I was in Bay 2. Brianna was in OR prep. Prakash was with a patient on the other side of the department. She ran it again in her head, the same way she'd run building layouts, looking for the gap. The hallway camera on this corridor is one of the ones that came back up when the power restored. He was already on his radio, pulling the timestamp. 30 seconds later, his agent came back with footage on a tablet, and they watched 43 seconds of grainy emergency power resolution showing the Bay 7 corridor. At the 19-second mark, a figure moved through frame. The figure was moving with Greer. Not dragging him. Greer was ambulatory, slow but upright, the specific gait of a man managing pain while choosing to move. He was cooperating, which meant the note wasn't a warning from someone trying to expose Rourke. It was from Greer himself. She said it before Rourke did. He moved himself. He saw something that made him trust the room less than the corridor. Or someone told him something. Rourke enlarged the frame. The figure with Greer was partially obscured, but the build, the movement pattern, she looked at it and felt something cold settle in her chest. "I don't recognize that coat," Rourke said. "I do." She'd seen it in the waiting room at 4:30 when she'd done a sweep of the lobby for Rourke. Dark green, canvas, military surplus cut. The man wearing it had been sitting in the chairs near the vending machine with a phone in his hand and a paper coffee cup going cold on the seat beside him. She'd clocked him as a family member waiting for news. He came in through the front entrance. Front desk would have a visitor log. Rourke was already moving. She kept pace with him, which her shoulder was now specifically unhappy about, and she did not slow down. The visitor log at the front desk was electronic, and the entry at 4:28 p.m. said the man had signed in as David Farrell, visitor for a patient named Lena Marsh in room 214. She pulled up 214 on the hospital system in under 10 seconds. Room 214 was occupied by a 67-year-old woman admitted for a hip replacement 3 days ago. No relation named David Farrell in her file. No David Farrell in the visitor pre-authorization system at all. The name was fabricated. The access was real. He walked in through the front door with a fake name, she said, which means he had enough time to plan this before the convoy ambush, which means the ambush and this were coordinated in advance, which means the inside source moved faster than we thought. Rourke's voice had dropped to the register of someone thinking out loud to a person he'd decided to trust. The convoy route was leaked. The hospital destination was leaked. And now Greer moves himself because someone got to him first with information I don't have access to. She worked through the geometry of it. Greer was smart. She'd established that in 3 conversations. He'd survived 19 months in a cooperation agreement by being better at reading rooms than the people trying to close them. If someone had reached him with credible information that Rourke was compromised, he wouldn't have waited. He would have moved to a position he could control with a person he'd chosen himself. "Where does someone in Walter Greer's condition go in this building?" she said. "If he wants to disappear for 40 minutes and he can walk but not fast." Rourke said, "You know this building. Basement level. The imaging corridor has 3 alcoves that aren't on the main patient flow map. The staff only use them for equipment storage, long-term parking for the portable MRI when it's not on rotation." She thought, "There's also the chapel annex. It's technically decommissioned, hasn't been used in 2 years, but the door is functional and there's no camera coverage." "Where first?" "Imaging. It's closer to the maintenance corridors he'd know about from the note he left us. He'd want proximity to an exit he already understood." They moved. The basement imaging corridor was low-lit and smelled of machine coolant and the specific industrial cleaner the night crew used on linoleum. The 3 alcoves were on the east wall, behind heavy equipment curtains that had been there since a renovation that reprioritized floor space over storage aesthetics. Norah walked the corridor once, reading the slight disturbances in the curtain fabric, the dust patterns on the floor. Second alcove. The floor dust had been disturbed recently, not dramatically, not someone trying to cover tracks, just the ordinary movement of feet. She pushed the curtain aside. Greer was sitting on an equipment crate with his back to the wall and his good arm in his lap, and his injured arm pressed against his side in the position people took when they'd learned that stillness hurt less than movement. He had a phone in his good hand that wasn't his hospital phone. Burner, she read, prepaid, the kind you bought in cash. And he looked up when she came in with the specific absence of surprise of someone who'd calculated exactly this outcome. "I was wondering which one of you would find me first," he said. "You left the note for us." She stepped into the alcove. Rourke positioned himself at the curtain. "You moved yourself out of a secured room with a penetrating shoulder injury because someone told you Rourke was the leak." "Someone told me something. I didn't say I believed it." He looked past her at Rourke. "Are you?" Rourke said, "No." "Who told you to doubt him?" Norah asked. Greer shifted on the crate. She could see the effort that shift cost him. His face didn't change, but his breathing did. A controlled compression of the exhale. "About 25 minutes ago, I got a call on this number. I've had this phone for 14 months. 3 people in the world know the number. 2 of them are in federal custody as part of my cooperation agreement. The 3rd is a woman named Patricia Weil, who is a senior prosecutor in the DOJ task force overseeing the investigation." He paused. "She told me that evidence recovered from the communications equipment on the men from the corridor traces the leak to Rourke's unit, specifically to his operational authorization codes." Norah looked at Rourke. Rourke's face was very still. "She's en route to this facility," Greer continued. "ETA was given to me as 40 minutes, which was 22 minutes ago." "She's the lead investigator," Norah said. "Yes." Rourke said, "Well, has been on this case from the beginning. She has access to everything, every route, every safe house, every protection arrangement." "Which makes her the most credible source of the leak," Norah said, "or the most useful person to frame as the leak." The alcove was quiet for a moment except for the low hum of the portable MRI housing. Greer looked at her. She called me. From a number I trust. Numbers can be spoofed, she said. Communications equipment can be seeded with false authorization codes after the fact. If someone wanted to redirect suspicion from themselves to Rourke, intercepting a known contact line and placing a call before the investigator arrived would do exactly that. She held his gaze. What did Wiles' voice sound like on the call? A pause. Like her. Was there background noise? He thought about it. Traffic outside. She's en route in a federal vehicle. Those vehicles don't have road noise. She let that sit for 1 second. Someone synthesized her voice or intercepted the line and used a recorded sample. Technology to do that isn't classified. It's commercially available. Greer was quiet. He was running it back. She could see it. The call, the voice, the specific content of what he'd been told, checking each element against what she'd just said. If I'm wrong, she said, and Rourke is the leak, moving you back to a secured position costs us nothing except time. If you're wrong, and Weil is being set up, then whoever set her up knew you'd run from Rourke's protection. Which means right now you're exactly where they want you. Isolated, accessible, separated from your protection detail. The silence this time was different. Greer's face changed. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes. The look of a man recalibrating. He stood up from the crate. It cost him. He didn't complain about it. What do you need from me? Come back to the department. Let us put you somewhere defensible. When Weil arrives, we handle it in person, in front of people, on record. She paused. And give me that phone. He handed it over. Getting Greer back upstairs was not elegant. He was ambulatory but slow, the shoulder wound limiting his movement in ways he managed through will rather than comfort. And the basement corridor was not built for 3 people moving with any particular urgency. Rourke took his left side. Norah took the right, her compromised shoulder on the outside, which was worse but left the better arm free if she needed it. On the elevator, Greer said, "You're hurt." "I'm functional." "That's a direct echo of what you told Rourke about me 4 hours ago. I learned it from a good patient." He made a sound that in different circumstances might have been a laugh. They came back into the ER at 6:07 p.m. Sandra was at the station. Her expression when she saw them was a concentrated version of the 22 years. Relief, an assessment, and a carefully maintained professional surface over both. "Bay 4 is clean," she said. "I moved the equipment cart, and it's the most defensible position that's not directly visible from the main entrance." Norah looked at her. "You set this up." Rourke called ahead from the elevator. Sandra was already moving. "Also, you look terrible, and your shoulder is at an angle it wasn't at this morning, and when this is over, you are going in for imaging before you do one more thing." "When this is over," Norah agreed. They got Greer into Bay 4, and Sandra was already running a new IV line. The previous one had been out for over 30 minutes. She needed fluids, and the shoulder wound needed monitoring. And Norah stood at the bay entrance and looked at the clock on the wall and calculated. Patricia Wiles' convoy was now approximately 16 minutes out. Rourke came to stand beside her. He had his phone in his hand and he was looking at it with the specific expression of someone who had just made a decision they weren't sure about. "I called someone I trust outside this chain," he said. "Former commanding officer, retired. No connection to the current investigation. I described the technical parameters of the comms equipment and the authorization code situation. He called back in 4 minutes. And? He said the authorization code format described to Greer doesn't match anything currently active in federal protective operations. The format was deprecated 14 months ago." She turned to look at him. "Whoever built the false evidence used an old code structure. Old enough that it would look right to someone who didn't know to check the version date, but wrong enough that someone who does know, knows immediately." He put the phone away. "It's not me." "I know," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You knew before my call. I had a read on you from this afternoon, but reads can be wrong, so I would have waited for corroboration." She paused. "The corroboration helped." He was quiet for a moment. Well, is going to walk in here with a team, with case authority, and with information that was fed to her from the same source that placed the call to Greer. She's going to try to take him. I know. We can't stop a senior DOJ prosecutor from accessing her own witness. We can create the conditions under which accessing him requires going through a public conversation with sufficient people present that any misrepresentation gets documented in real time. She thought through it. What I need is to get the communications equipment, the actual hardware from the men in the corridor, into a different chain of custody before she arrives. If the false authorization codes exist on that equipment, they're also the evidence that exposes the person who planted them. My agents have it. Where? Secured in the vehicle. Move it, now. Not to another vehicle, somewhere in this building under your custody that isn't accessible from the parking structure. Because if there's an inside person on Wile's team, the vehicle is the first thing they'd go to. Rourke was already moving to the door. He stopped with one hand on the frame. 8 months ago when I started looking for you, I was thinking in terms of a person who could keep a witness alive in a compromised location. He said it without performance. I wasn't thinking about the rest of this. Most people don't, she said. He left. She went to check on Greer. He was lying back with his eyes open, the new IV running, his color marginally better than it had been in the basement. She checked his pressure. 94/62, still low but stable, better than it had been in the imaging suite. The shoulder dressing was intact. The prosecutor who's coming, he said. Wile, do you think she knows what was done with her name? No. If she'd been turned, the call would have come from her directly. Someone used her as a cover story, which means she's a target of whoever is running this, not a participant. She adjusted the IV drip. She's going to walk in here not knowing that her name was used to move you. That's going to make the next 20 minutes complicated. She doesn't trust complications. I gathered. She's been doing this for 16 years. She's careful and she's good, and she does not respond well to people telling her she's been used. He looked at the ceiling. She's also going to want to know why I left the protection unit. We'll tell her the truth. The truth involves someone synthesizing her voice from a recorded sample. Yes, she's going to love that. She doesn't have to love it. She just has to be in a room with the physical evidence before anyone else gets to it. Norah checked the monitor. Can you reach her directly? Not through the case line. Personal contact. Greer was quiet for a moment. Yes. Then call her now, before she arrives. Tell her the situation in your own words, from your own account. Don't give her a conclusion. Give her the sequence of events and let her reach the conclusion herself. Smart people who are being told they've been manipulated need to find the conclusion independently. Hand it to them, they resist it. He looked at her. That's a specific piece of knowledge. I've worked with a lot of people under pressure. Where? She met his gaze. Make the call, Walter. He made the call. She stepped out of the bay to give him privacy, and she stood in the corridor and breathed carefully through her shoulder for a moment, and she thought about the note. They know about Rourke, and about who had known enough to make that call credible to a man who had survived 19 months by being very hard to fool. Someone who knew Greer's contact protocols, someone who knew the burner number that only 3 people had, someone who knew enough about federal protection operations to use the right name, the right format, the right timing. The number of people who could have all 3 of those things was not large. She was still working through it when Hale appeared from the direction of the OR corridor, changed out of scrubs into his ordinary clothes, looking like a man who'd been through something and was still processing the edges of it. OR2 patient is closed, he said. Stable. OR3 patient is still in progress, but the surgeon says another 40 minutes. He stopped when he saw her shoulder. How long has that been? A while. That's not... I know. Later. She looked at him. I need something from you. He waited. When the federal prosecutor arrives, her name is Patricia Weil. She's going to try to move quickly and establish authority and access. She's going to want to see the witness, and she's going to want to do it without the kind of process that slows things down. She held his gaze. I need you to slow things down. Hale looked at her for a moment. How? You're the physician of record for the patient. His medical status is your call. The patient is not stable for interview or transport without your clearance, and your clearance requires a current assessment, and a current assessment takes the time it takes. I'd be using his medical status as a procedural delay. You'd be accurately describing a patient who had a penetrating shoulder wound, was moved without medical supervision for over 20 minutes, and has been running a low blood pressure for the last 4 hours. She paused. His condition genuinely requires your assessment. I'm just asking you to do your job thoroughly. He was quiet. She watched him work through it, the physician's version of the same calculation she'd been running all day, where the technically defensible thing and the strategically necessary thing happened to be the same thing. Understood, he said. She almost smiled at hearing her own word back in his mouth. Weil arrived at 6:31 p.m. She was not what Norah had built in her head from Greer's description, which was a useful reminder about building people in advance. Patricia Weil was 53, shorter than expected, with the compact energy of someone who had learned to make rooms pay attention quickly or not at all. She came through the main entrance with 2 people at her back, not the profile of a corrupt actor, Norah noted, but of someone who'd been briefed on a security situation and responded proportionally. One of the 2 she recognized from federal service. The other was new. Weil's eyes found Rourke first, then moved past him and found Norah. It was a read, fast, efficient, ending with a slight adjustment of her expression that said she'd landed somewhere more complicated than expected. "You're the nurse," she said. "I'm the nurse," Norah confirmed. Weil looked at Rourke. "Where's Greer?" "He's being assessed by the attending physician," Rourke said. "He had a medical episode during the earlier security incident. We can take you to him when the assessment is complete." Weil's jaw tightened. "I don't need the assessment to be complete to—" "Patricia." It was Greer's voice. He'd pushed the bay curtain back himself, which Norah had told him not to do and which she noted as a point in his character profile labeled, "does what he's going to do." He was upright, IV pole beside him, looking at Weil with the expression of someone who had something specific to say and had chosen the timing carefully. Weil looked at him. Something moved in her face that was not professional. "Walter, you were supposed to stay in the room." "Someone told me not to trust it." "I know, that's why I'm here." She moved toward him and Norah stepped into the gap, not blocking, just present. Weil stopped. "Nurse." "Vasquez," Norah said it levelly. "The call Greer received was placed using a synthesized version of your voice over a spoofed line. Someone used your identity and your relationship with this witness to move him out of secured protection. The communications equipment recovered from the corridor team contains evidence of who that was. Agent Rourke has it in secure custody in this building." She paused. "Before anyone goes anywhere with anyone, I'd recommend you look at that equipment." Weil looked at her for a long moment. "You're a nurse," she said. It was not dismissive. It was the statement of someone trying to reconcile 2 things that didn't fit the same category. "Among other things," Norah said. Another beat. Weil looked at Rourke. "Show me the equipment." "It's in a secure location in this building," Rourke said. "I can take you there, but I want 2 things first. I want your authorization codes on record before you see it. Current format, not the deprecated version. So that when the equipment shows a different format, there's documented baseline for comparison. And I want the second member of your team to stay in the corridor while we do this." Weil's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me to exclude one of my people." "I'm documenting who was present when the evidence was accessed. That's protective for everyone." He held her gaze. "Including you." A long beat. The kind of silence that had decisions in it. Weil said, "Fine." She turned to the second person in her team, the one Norah didn't recognize. "Wait here." He didn't visibly react. He nodded, clasped his hands in front of him. Norah watched him. She couldn't have said exactly what it was. Not a single thing. Not a gesture. Not an expression. Just the accumulation of small data points that her brain had been collecting and hadn't finished organizing. The way he'd moved through the entrance, the specific position he'd taken when Weil's attention was elsewhere, the fact that his eyes had gone to the corridor behind the nurse's station before they'd gone to Greer. She crossed to Sandra at the station, kept her voice below the ambient noise. The man at the entrance who stayed behind. Has he moved? Sandra glanced up without making it look like a glance. He's been looking at the supply corridor since Vile went with Rourke. Get Prakash out of the supply corridor. He's not in. Get him out anyway. Sandra moved. Norah turned back. The man at the entrance was now looking at her. She looked back. He had the look of someone who'd been running a calculation and reached the end of it. She'd seen that look before. The specific resolution that came when a person stopped considering options and started operating. She was already tracking the distance, the obstacles, the angle to Bay 4 where Greer was standing in the open curtain, and then his hand went to his jacket. Hale stepped out of a supply room directly in front of him. He wasn't doing it on purpose. He didn't know. He stepped out of the supply room with a tablet in his hand and his eyes on the screen, and he walked directly into the man's path. And the man's reaching hand hit the tablet instead of the jacket pocket, and Hale stumbled back against the corridor wall with the bewildered expression of someone who had absolutely not planned to be in this situation. The 2 seconds that bought were the 2 seconds Norah needed. She didn't cover the distance. She crossed it. The man's weapon was partially clear of his jacket when she controlled the arm, and the fight was short and unpleasant and ended with him face down on the corridor floor and Norah on one knee, with her compromised shoulder screaming at her in very specific terms. Hale was against the wall. His tablet was on the floor. He was looking at the man on the floor, and then at Norah, and then back at the man. He's carrying, she said, breathing harder than she wanted to. Don't touch anything. Call security and tell them to hold the main entrance. Hale didn't move for 1 second. Then he pulled out his phone. She looked at the man on the floor. Who sent you? He said nothing. The equipment is already in Rourke's custody, she said. The authorization codes are already documented. The call to Greer's burner is already traced. Whatever you were here to finish, it's done. He looked at the floor and said nothing. She stood up. Her shoulder was now beyond the category of manageable, and into the category of she was going to have to deal with this today regardless of what else happened. She breathed through it. Hale lowered his phone. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in 4 months. Not the physician authority register, not the dismissal register, not the recalibrating register. Something simpler than all of them. Something that might, in a different context, have been called shaken. You just, he started. I know. You broke his grip without, Marcus. He stopped. I need you to keep him here until federal security arrives. Can you do that? He looked at the man on the floor, at his own height and weight advantage, at Nora's expression. He said, yes. Good. She straightened. Her shoulder had a very specific message for her that she acknowledged and set aside. Thank you for stepping out when you did. I didn't know. I know you didn't. She held his gaze for 1 second. It still helped. She went to find Rourke. She found him in the break room at the end of the east corridor, the most defensible interior room with no exterior windows, which was why he'd chosen it. The communications equipment was on the table. Weil was bent over it, reading something on a screen her technical agent was holding, and her face had the particular quality of a person confronting a thing they had known intellectually was possible, but had not yet seen in concrete form. Norah came in. Rourke looked at her, read her shoulder, her expression, the fact that she was alone. The second team member, he said, in the corridor with Hale. He needs to be taken into federal custody. Weil looked up. Something in her face had reorganized itself since she'd arrived. The professional efficiency was still there, but the certainty underneath it was different now, more careful. Who is he? I don't know yet, Norah said. But I know he was watching the supply corridor, and he went for a weapon when he understood what the equipment in this room was going to prove. She looked at the screen Weil's agent was holding. What does it prove? Weil straightened. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing how much to say and to whom. Then she turned the screen around. The authorization codes on the equipment were in the deprecated format, exactly as Rourke's contact had described. But beside them, flagged by Weil's technical agent in the last 8 minutes, was something else. A timestamp sequence embedded in the communication metadata, and a digital identifier that traced to a specific device registration, not Rourke's. She read the identifier, looked up at Weil. That's a DOD contracting office registration, Norah said. Yes. Wiles' voice was flat in the way of someone containing something large. Specifically, the office of Deputy Director Alan Marsh, who is one of the 14 officials named in Greer's cooperation agreement. She paused. And who has been on the oversight committee for the federal protection program that assigned Rourke's unit to this case? The room was quiet. Norah thought about the 14 officials, about $2 billion in diverted military equipment, about armor that didn't reach vehicles, about medical supplies that went to private buyers in 4 countries, about a convoy on Highway 34 and a highway massacre that was supposed to end this investigation before it reached a courtroom, about the device identifier on the screen, attached to a man who had access to every route, every protocol, every safe house. And then she thought about the man currently in the corridor with Marcus Hale, and about Deputy Director Alan Marsh's office, and about who that man worked for. She looked at Rourke, the second team member. He's not DOJ. Rourke's expression shifted. No, he's Marsh's. That's my read. Wiles said, if Marsh knew this facility had Greer, if he sent someone to intercept the evidence before I could access it. She stopped, pressed her lips together. He knew I was coming here. He would have known before I knew. Because he was monitoring your communications, Norah said. Wiles looked at the screen, at the identifier, at 19 months of work that had just found its center of gravity. She reached for her phone with the specific purpose of someone who had decided what to do and was doing it. She was halfway through dialing when Rourke's radio activated. His agent's voice from the corridor. Rourke, the man in the corridor. He had a second phone on him, active call, already running when we took him down. Someone was listening. Wiles' hand stopped. They looked at each other. How long was the call active? Norah asked. A pause from the radio. Timestamp says it connected at 6:29 p.m. 6:29. 2 minutes before Wiles arrived, which meant whoever was on the other end of that call had been listening since before Wiles walked through the door, had heard the conversation in the corridor, had heard Wiles direct her second team member to stay behind, had heard the equipment discussion, had heard Wiles say fine, and had known in that moment that the evidence chain was closing. Norah said, where is Marsh right now? Wiles said, he's supposed to be in Washington. Is he? A long pause. Wiles picked up her phone and dialed a different number, held it to her ear, waited. 5 seconds, 10, 15. She lowered it. His office says he left for a field visit this afternoon, she said. Unscheduled. They don't have a destination. The break room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the hospital's remaining working systems, a monitor alarmed briefly and stopped. The backup power hummed in the walls. Rourke's radio stayed silent. Norah looked at the communications equipment on the table, at the timestamp, at the identifier that pointed to a man who was currently unlocated, who had been listening through a live phone for the last 12 minutes, who knew that the evidence was in this room and that his name was on it. She looked at Wiles. He's not in Washington, she said, and from the ambulance bay entrance at the far end of the building, a sound. Engine. Heavy vehicle. Not an ambulance. Rourke moved first. He was at the break room door before the engine sound fully resolved, radio already up, his voice clipped and quiet. All positions, unknown vehicle at ambulance bay, do not engage, hold positions, and report. He looked back at Wiles. How many people does Marsh travel with? He has a personal security detail, 2, sometimes 3. Wiles' voice had gone very flat, the flatness of someone managing a specific kind of anger. Not hot, but pressurized. The kind that came from understanding you'd been used by someone you'd worked alongside for years. He wouldn't come here himself. That's not how he operates. He's been listening for 12 minutes, Norah said. He knows the evidence chain is closed. He knows you have his identifier. He knows his man in the corridor is down. She was already moving toward the door. He's not here to finish a job. He's here because he's out of options, and he's calculating whether there's still a play. What play? Wiles said. The evidence. If he can take the hardware before it's formally logged into federal custody, the identifier disappears with it. Without it, you have a deprecated authorization code and a circumstantial case. Defensible, maybe. Survivable, for a man with his resources and his lawyers. She looked at the equipment on the table. That's what he's here for. Rourke said, then we don't let him have it. He looked at his remaining agent, a woman named Ito, who had been silent and positioned in the corner since Vile arrived, and something passed between them in the shorthand of people who had worked enough situations together. Log it. Right now. Formal chain of custody, your badge, my authorization, timestamp this minute. If the physical hardware walks out of this building, the log doesn't. Ito was already on it. Norah said, the ambulance bay connects directly to the ER floor. If he comes in that way, he comes through a space that has patients in it. Weil said, I'm calling this in. Full federal response. She was already dialing. Whatever he thinks he's doing out there, he needs to understand what's waiting for him when the next unit arrives. How long? 20 minutes for the nearest field team. 20 minutes was not a short time. Norah walked back to the door, read the corridor, read the department beyond. She could see Sandra at the nurse's station managing the floor with the particular steady competence that Norah had learned to rely on. She could see Greer in Bay 4, still upright, watching the department entrance. She could see Hale standing near the man on the floor in the corridor, holding his position, phone in hand, looking like someone who'd decided something about himself tonight and wasn't entirely sure what it was yet. She went to the ambulance bay access door and looked through the narrow window in it. The vehicle outside was dark. Government plates, black SUV, parked at the angle of something that had arrived in controlled urgency rather than speed. She could see a figure near the driver's side. Not Marsh, the build was wrong, and a second near the rear of the vehicle. Two people visible, which meant the third was not visible, which was the one she cared about. She stepped back from the door and let herself think for exactly the amount of time she had. Marsh was 61 years old, a career bureaucrat who had learned to use other people for the operational elements of everything he did. He was not going to come through a door first. He was going to send someone and watch what happened and then decide how to position himself based on the outcome. If his people reached the hardware, he had leverage. If they didn't, he was a senior official who had come to a hospital to check on a federal witness in an active security situation, and any connection to the events of the day was something his lawyers would spend the next 3 years making complicated. The play wasn't violence. He'd already tried that 3 times tonight, and it hadn't worked. The play was confusion, delay, the procedural machinery that powerful people used when the direct option closed. She went back to Weil. He's going to come in the front, she said, not the bay. He's going to come in officially, with credentials, with a reason that sounds legitimate, and he's going to ask to see the witness and review the evidence under his oversight authority. He's going to try to make this a supervision visit. Weil looked at her. Can he do that? Norah asked. A pause. He has the authority, technically. Weil's jaw was tight. His committee oversees federal protection operations. He can claim jurisdictional review. Then we need the chain of custody logged before he walks through that door, and we need Greer on record. His account, his statement, the call he received, everything, before Marsh can establish a procedural frame around this. She looked at Weil directly. You're the senior DOJ officer on site. That's not his committee. That's your chain. Weil held her gaze for a moment. You're telling me how to do my job. I'm telling you what I see from outside your job, which is sometimes a cleaner view. She didn't back down from it. You've been building this case for 19 months. He's been inside it from the beginning, watching what you had, routing information to the contractors who had the most to lose. He used your name to move your witness. He put a man in your team tonight to listen. She paused. You know what you need to do. Something in Weil's face resolved, not softened, resolved, the way a structure settles when the last piece locks. Ito, she said, I need Greer's formal statement recorded in the next 8 minutes, my authorization. She looked at Norah. And I need whatever this nurse knows about tonight in a written account that goes into the federal record. You'll have it, Norah said. She went to Greer first. He was watching her come across the department floor with the same active assessment he'd been running since she first walked into his bay. She stopped at the curtain and said, Marsh is outside. We'll need your statement now, recorded, before he comes in. Greer sat up straighter, winced. Marsh is here himself. Yes. He's more scared than I thought. He said it simply, not with satisfaction. Just the read of a man who'd spent 19 months understanding how frightened people moved. He wouldn't come here if he had another option. He doesn't have another option. That's why we need to move. He looked at her. You know what gets me, after all of this? He didn't wait for an answer. I spent 14 years inside that procurement system. I knew something was wrong for the last 4 of them. I told myself I didn't have enough to act, that I needed more proof, more time, more certainty. He paused. People went without armor because I waited for certainty. She held his gaze. You're here now. I'm here now because I eventually ran out of ways to explain not acting. He met her eyes. That's not heroism. That's just what's left when you finally stop lying to yourself. She didn't offer him absolution. She didn't tell him it was okay or that he'd done what he could or any of the things people said to make the past sit lighter. She just said, Ito is going to take your statement. Give her everything, from the beginning. Don't edit. I know how to give a statement. I know you do. She paused at the curtain. Walter, thank you for the 12 seconds. He looked at her for a moment. Thank you for all the seconds after them. She went back to the corridor and gave her own account to Ito in the time she had. Not everything, not the parts of her background that were above Ito's clearance, but the operational sequence of the night in precise order. Times, observations, decisions, outcomes. The kind of account that wouldn't bend under cross-examination because it was built from what she'd seen and done, not from what sounded good in retrospect. She was finishing when the front entrance opened. She knew it before she heard it. She'd positioned herself with a sight line to the lobby glass, and she saw the shape of him before the automatic doors had fully parted. Alan Marsh was tall, white-haired, with the bearing of a man who had spent decades in rooms that arranged themselves around him. He had 2 people at his back and his credentials already in his hand, and the expression of someone who had decided to walk into a situation as though he'd been expecting it all along. He came in looking for Vile. He found Norah. She was standing at the entrance to the ER corridor and she didn't move, and she said, Sir, can I help you find someone? He looked at her. The look that people in his position gave to people in her position, a rapid categorization, a filing, a dismissal. I'm here to see Deputy Prosecutor Weil, he said. Stand aside, please. She's completing an evidence review. She'll be available shortly. Norah kept her voice level. Can I get your name for the visitor log? He looked at her the way he'd look at a door that wasn't opening. I don't need to sign a visitor log. I have federal oversight authority over this. This is a hospital, she said. Visitor log is hospital policy. We apply it to everyone. She held out the tablet. Your name, sir. Behind him, his 2 security people were reading the situation and reading her and arriving at different conclusions than Marsh was. She could see it. They'd been in enough situations to know the difference between an obstacle and a position, and she was occupying a position. Marsh looked at the tablet, looked at her, made the calculation that arguing with a nurse over a visitor log was not the version of this entrance he'd planned. He took the tablet, signed it. The timestamp on that signature was 6:58 p.m. Weil came into the lobby at 6:59. She had Ito at her left and Rourke at her right, and the look of someone who had spent the last 14 minutes closing every procedural door in the building. She stopped 6 feet from Marsh and looked at him the way you looked at something you'd finally named correctly after a long time calling it the wrong thing. Alan, she said. Patricia. He matched her register. 2 people in a professional relationship managing a difficult situation. He was good at it. I came as soon as I understood what was happening here. This operation had exposure I wasn't briefed on and I need to review. The evidence chain is logged, she said. Formal federal custody as of 6:51 p.m. Agent Ito's badge, my authorization. It's in the system. A small pause, the kind that meant something. I'd like to review the evidence myself, given my oversight. The evidence is flagged for independent review outside your committee's purview, effective this hour, based on a conflict of interest determination I've made as senior DOJ officer on site. She paused. Your device identifier is in the communication metadata, Alan. We have the timestamp. We have the call to Greer's protected line. We have the authorization code format that traces to your office. She said it quietly, without theater, The way you said things that didn't need help from your voice to be devastating. And I have Walter Greer's recorded statement, taken 40 minutes ago, describing every contact he's had with individuals connected to your office over the last 6 weeks. Marsh's security detail had gone very still. He looked at Weil, he looked at Rourke, he looked briefly at Norah. And this time the look was different than the first one. This time there was something in it that recognized it had miscategorized something important. I want my attorneys present before any further. You'll have them, Weil said. You have that right, but you're not leaving this building tonight. She nodded to Rourke, who stepped forward, and the look on Marsh's face in the moment before Rourke reached him was not anger and was not defiance. It was the look of a man who had run out of the one thing he'd always had enough of before. Room to move. It wasn't clean. None of it was. His attorneys arrived within the hour, and the next 4 hours were procedural noise, statements and counterclaims, and the specific machinery of a federal arrest that involved someone with Marsh's clearance level and connections. There were phone calls Norah wasn't part of, and conversations in rooms she wasn't in, and the kind of institutional upheaval that happened when a weight-bearing piece of a large structure turned out to be compromised. She was in the imaging suite getting her shoulder scanned when Rourke found her. The result was a grade 2 AC joint sprain and a partial tear of the supraspinatus, which was better than she'd feared and worse than she'd pretended all evening. The radiologist on duty had looked at the images and then at her and said, "How long have you been working with this?" And she'd said, "A few hours." And he'd looked at her the way people looked at things they didn't fully believe. Rourke sat down in the chair across from the imaging bay. He looked like someone had removed approximately 30 pounds of pressure from the space between his shoulder blades. "It's over," he said. "Marsh. In custody. Weil's team is executing a search of his office and residence right now. The field offices connected to the 14 named officials are all getting simultaneous visits tonight." He paused. "The contractors, the buyers in the 4 countries, the whole chain." He looked at his hands for a moment. "Greer's testimony doesn't have to fight a corrupted oversight committee anymore. It goes straight to trial." She absorbed this. Outside the imaging suite window, the hospital was settling into its late-night register. Quieter, slower, the particular rhythm of a building that had been through something and was still standing. "Your additional team," she said. "The 2 you lost in the convoy. Reyes and Montoya." He said their names with the specific weight of someone who would carry them. "Both had families." She said, "I'm sorry." "I know." He looked at her. "What you did tonight, the room assessment, the note, pulling Greer from the basement, the corridor work, the timing on Marsh's entry, most of that wasn't nursing." "No." "You want to tell me what it was?" She looked at the imaging screen where her shoulder joint showed in black and white and gray. It was 8 years of learning how to keep people alive when the situation was actively trying to kill them. And then it was 4 months of a different kind of work in a place where nobody knew what I'd been. And that turned out to matter in ways I wasn't expecting. "You could do more than this," he said. Not as a recruitment pitch, she would have heard that and would have ended the conversation, as a plain observation. "I know," she said, "but I chose this." "Why?" She thought about the real answer, not the one that fit in a sentence. "Because emergency nursing is the version of what I know how to do that helps people who didn't ask for what happened to them. Nobody in that waiting room chose to be there. Nobody on that gurney planned their day around being a patient." She paused. "I spent 8 years in situations where most of the harm was chosen by someone. I wanted to work somewhere where the harm was just accidental, human, the kind you can actually fix." She looked at him. "Most of the time." He nodded slowly. "Tonight wasn't most of the time. Tonight was what tonight was." She stood up carefully, favoring the shoulder. "What happens to the file Hale put in my record?" "Weil's going to want a full account of the hospital personnel involved tonight. Your actions are going to be in that account in detail." He paused. "I think a notation in a nursing file is probably the least of your concerns." She wasn't asking for reassurance. She was asking a practical question about a practical problem. "He hasn't pulled it yet." "Talk to him," Rourke said. "I have a feeling the conversation is different than it would have been this morning." It was nearly 10 p.m. when she found Hale. He was in his office. The desk was the same disaster it always was. The window still faced a concrete wall. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and he didn't do the thing he usually did, which was establish immediately that her presence required explanation. He just looked at her. She sat down across from him, which she'd never done before. The chair was uncomfortable in the way of chairs that were bought for a budget and not for sitting in. "The file notation," she said. "I've already contacted administration to have it removed." He said it simply. "It was submitted on the basis of a judgment I've revised." "When did you revise it?" "Around 2:45 p.m., when you told me to move a patient to surgery, and you were right." He said it without flinching from it. "I kept revising it throughout the rest of the day." She said nothing. "I don't have a clean explanation for how I treated you," he said. "I've been telling myself that I have high standards and I enforce them without consideration of who I'm applying them to. But that's not—" He stopped. "Try it again. I see someone come in who looks a certain way, who reacts a certain way, and I make a read, and my reads have been—" Another stop. "I have blind spots." "Yes," she said. "You do." He looked at her. He'd expected maybe a softer landing for the acknowledgement. "That's it? What else do you want?" "I don't know. Absolution, maybe." "I'm not the person who gives you that," she said. "What I can tell you is that you held a man in a corridor tonight when you didn't know why I was asking you to, and you did it anyway. And earlier you followed an order you didn't want to follow because you trusted the outcome. That's not nothing." She paused. "Neither is it everything. You have staff who've been managed the same way you managed me, who weren't able to do what I did, which is decide not to leave." She met his gaze. "Think about them." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I will," he said. And he said it the way people said things when they meant them, not when they were ending a conversation. She stood up. "Vasquez." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. "What are you going to do with your record when it comes out?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I've been doing this job for 4 months and I'm going to keep doing it. What comes with that? I'll figure it out." He nodded once. She went back to the floor. Sandra was still there. She would not have expected otherwise. Sandra was at the nurse's station with a cold coffee and the overnight board, and the look of someone who had decided a long time ago that she would not leave a floor until she was ready to leave it, and not 1 minute before. She looked up when Norah came back to the station, and she took in the sling Norah had been given for the shoulder and the 11-hour shift on her face and said, "Sit down." "I'm fine." "Sit down anyway." Norah sat. Sandra put the cold coffee in front of her. "Greer's stable. Rourke's people have him. Well, says transport to a secure facility happens at 0600. She folded her hands on the counter. "The 2 OR patients are both post-op and holding. Hale's night resident is capable." She paused. "The floor is covered." "Good." "Norah." Sandra's voice shifted. "I've worked emergency nursing for 22 years. I've worked with a lot of people. Good ones and bad ones and ones I couldn't read at all." She looked at her directly. "I couldn't read you. For 4 months I tried." "I know." "Tonight helped." Sandra paused. "But I want you to know I was on your side before tonight. Not because I knew what you were. Because I could see you doing the work right and being treated like you weren't." Something moved in Nora's chest. Not dramatically, just something that had been held in a particular position for a long time, shifting slightly. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to thank me for basic decency." "I know. I'm thanking you anyway." Sandra picked up her own coffee. "When you come back from leave for that shoulder, and you are taking leave, I'll fight you on that. I'm going to recommend to administration that we develop a new triage protocol based on what I watched you do today. The multi-bay assessment, the prioritization model during the mass casualty wave." She said it like a practical matter. "You're going to help me write it." Norah looked at her. "I thought you couldn't read me." "I couldn't read your past. I can read your work." Sandra's expression didn't change, but her eyes did something. "Those are different things." Work found her at midnight, near the end of it all, standing at the ambulance bay doors looking at the parking lot that had been so many things tonight and was now just a parking lot again. Quiet. Empty. the yellow lights in the overhead doing their ordinary work. He came to stand beside her. He had a small, flat case in his hand, military issue, worn at the corners. "I need to give you something," he said. "Greer asked me to, before transport." She looked at the case. She knew what shape it was. She'd seen that shape before, on other occasions, in other circumstances, always when something that had happened was being formally acknowledged to have happened. "That's not Greer's to give," she said. "No," Rourke said. "It's yours. It's been yours for 6 years." He held it out. "The record that classified your Silver Ridge service, that's being reviewed. The people who made that decision had reasons that no longer exist." He paused. "You earned this, in a place that wasn't here. Greer just wanted to make sure you didn't have to wait any longer for someone to say so out loud." She took the case. She didn't open it. She just held it in her hands for a moment, with her sling on one side and a shift's worth of everything behind her, and she let herself be in the space where a thing that had been unfinished for a long time was finished. The parking lot was quiet. Somewhere down the road, a car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the asphalt and gone. She thought about the soldiers who didn't come home from the place on the map that didn't have a name anymore. She thought about a 19-year-old version of herself learning that the people most likely to save you were not always the ones who looked the part. She thought about 4 months of being the nurse nobody looked at twice, and what she'd been able to see from that position, and whether she'd trade it. She wouldn't. There was something in being underestimated that people who'd never experienced it missed entirely. Not the injustice of it. The injustice was real, and she wasn't going to make peace with it. But what it gave you when you chose not to collapse into it, it gave you the whole room, every person in it, unguarded, showing you exactly who they were because they weren't performing for someone they took seriously. It gave you time to see what was actually there instead of what was supposed to be. She had used that time. Every day for 4 months, and in one specific way tonight, she had used it. She opened the case. The metal inside was smaller than people imagine metals to be. It always was. The things that got given to mark the moments that cost the most were always smaller than the moments themselves. That was right. That was how it should be. The moment didn't fit in a case. She closed it again. "Tell Greer thank you," she said. "Tell him yourself," Rourke said. "He'll be reachable when the trial starts. He's going to testify in full, and he wants you to be there." "As what?" "As someone who helped make it possible." Rourke looked at her sideways. "And as someone whose name is going to come up in the federal account, whether you're in the room or not." She thought about that. About her name in federal records, about a classified file being reviewed, about the version of Nora Vasquez that existed before the nursing badge, and the Navy scrubs, and the 4 months of understood doctor. "I'm going to need a few days," she said. "For the shoulder. For everything." He nodded. "Take them." She tucked the case under her good arm and turned back toward the hospital entrance. The automatic doors opened for her the way they'd opened for everyone tonight. Patients, agents, prosecutors, a corrupt official who'd run out of room, without preference, without judgment, the way the best places always did. She had patience to hand off, notes to complete, a shoulder that was going to spend the next 6 weeks reminding her it existed, a conversation with administration tomorrow, and after that probably a longer conversation, with more people in the room than she was used to. And after all of it, she was going to come back to this floor. To the bay doors and the overnight board and Sandra's cold coffee and the work of keeping people alive on their worst days. Not because it was all she was. She'd learned tonight, if she hadn't already known, that it was not all she was, but because it was what she chose. And choice, when it's made clearly and held deliberately against the pressure to abandon it, was the most honest form of strength she knew. She went back inside. The doors closed behind her. The night shift ran on. Well, some people are easy to see. They walk into rooms and demand your attention and make absolutely certain you know what they're worth. The dangerous ones, the ones who actually change outcomes, they're the ones you looked past. They're the nurse you spoke down to. The person in the corner you filed under not a threat. The quiet one who said, understood, and went back to work. Don't confuse silence for absence. Don't confuse stillness for surrender. The ones who've been through the fire don't always talk about it. They don't need you to know. They just need the work to get done. And when the moment comes, and it always comes, they're already in position.